G'day, welcome to Bradley's Bakehouse, where today we're going to be making Pain de Campagne. Country loaf. We're going to be making country loaves today. We're going to be making a sourdough version for those of you with cultures at home, and we're going to be making a non-sourdough version for those of you who don't. Pain de Campagne, or country loaves, are like one of those things where there's so many interpretations of it over the years that it's like really difficult to pin down exactly what it is. It's kind of like trying to figure out who wrote like an old folk song. There's really like typical things that generally speaking all of these versions share. So there's usually a percentage of wholemeal flour, there's usually some kind of pre-ferment. It doesn't necessarily need to be sourdough, but there is usually some kind of pre-ferment in there. And it's usually baked with steam in like a hearth style way. First up for our sourdough country loaf, we've got Lighthouse's bread and pizza flour, 11.9% protein, available at all 2 Australian supermarkets. We've got wholemeal flour. This loaf's gonna be 30% wholemeal flour. This isn't special, this is just like supermarket plain wholemeal flour. We've got sea salt, we've got water. This is gonna be 70% hydration. I've divided it from one is 65%, the other is 5%. We'll explain why when we're mixing. And we've got our culture. I tend to keep my culture at around 60% hydration. The person that I learned from kept their culture at 50%, which I thought was hella dry. I was used to the idea of culture being like the lovely Instagram bubbly mason jar thing, not like this just big fucking hunk of old dough sitting in a giant container. Yeah, it was wild. Feel free to match it. You would just mix, you would just change your ratio when you're mixing your levain to be 60% hydration instead of 100%, which is what I imagine a lot of yours are. The culture was fed probably about 14 hours ago. Like, it's lacy, it's active, it's ready to rumble. Also, I'm gonna be using a Kenwood stand mixer for this. There's really 2 stages when you're mixing dough. The first stage is our mixing phase. The second phase is our development phase. So in our first stage, we're just mixing all the ingredients together. And then in the second phase, we increase the speed. That's when the kneading would occur. That's when we're gonna make a gluten matrix. Establishing a gluten matrix is really important because that's going to act as like the net that catches all of the air that our lovely levain or yeast or whatever you're using creates. And that's what's going to make bread rise, give it those nice bubbles, make it airy. When it comes to making sourdough or something that's like high hydration, we have to do things a little bit differently because we're sort of fighting to establish a bit more gluten than we would need to on something like a lower hydration sandwich dough. Gluten typically develops better at lower hydration levels. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna get our flour, both our flours into the mixing bowl. So I'll whiten our wholemeal. This is why we separated the water. Our first round of water, which is 65%, I want everyone to keep in mind, this is fridge cold water, we're using cold water. I live in Queensland, Australia, where it is currently 27 degrees at 9:50 in the morning. So our first round of water is going in, this is 65%. That's gonna go in there, like so. And for this first round, I'm using the paddle attachment, or the K-beater that Ken would call it. Because all we're doing now, I'm gonna bring this down. So we're gonna mix this on its slowest speed for about 3 minutes, and then we're gonna cover it and leave it to autolyse for about an hour. Okay, so it's been about 3 minutes, and our dough is looking pretty wild. It's just sort of come together. It's a pretty shaggy mess. It's like a little bit sticky. But as you can see, it's just pulling off and like ripping off this beater. We don't need this anymore. We're done with this. We're gonna change to the dough hook in a bit. If you have a look at this, right? This just rips. This has absolutely no extensibility in it at all. Like, this just rips apart. That's not what we want. No gluten's really established in this. We've kind of just got wet flour. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna take a plate or whatever like fits over your stand, mixer bowl. You could use like cling wrap if you want. I just kind of don't like using the plastic. We're gonna cover this and we're gonna leave this for about an hour. And what's gonna happen is that this is gonna go through a process called autolyse. In short, the flour is gonna hydrate further and chemically a little bit of a gluten matrix is gonna begin to establish on its own. This is particularly useful when you're using like an at-home stand mixer because these things will never be able to create the same kind of gluten matrix as like a big boy spiral mixer with a breaker bar in a commercial bakery. I've experimented a lot with trying to get that same sort of gluten thing. An hour-long autolyse, it seems to be the way to go. I think any further than that, you do kind of hit the point of diminishing returns. It depends on how much time you have to burn, but we're gonna give this one an hour and we'll see. I'll do that stretch test again. You'll see just how much gluten develops just by leaving this to sit for an hour. So keep in mind, this was just the flours and like the first part of the water, 65% of the water. Haven't added the levain and haven't added the salt yet. So this is just gonna sit on its own, undisturbed for about an hour. Now I used fridge cold water because this sitting out in my bench in Queensland, Australia, that's gonna come up to room temperature. If you poured a glass of water out of your fridge and you left it on a bench for an hour, come back in an hour, it's gonna be room temp. That's the only reason that I did that, so it doesn't get too warm by the time we come to put our levain in, because then we're gonna bring it up to the final bit of the temperature that it's gonna bulk ferment at using the kinetic energy from the dough hook in the bowl. Cool, see you in an hour. Okay, so our hour-long autolyse is end. If we have a look at this now, do you remember how it was just like, we were pulling on this and it was just ripping and it was just breaking and we, had no elasticity to it? Look at this now, oh, look at that. It's coming together, it's pulling one piece, we've got gluten. Gluten has started developing through the autolyse process. We're here now, we're gonna attach our dough hook and we're gonna add our remaining ingredients. So the first thing we're gonna put in, this is the remaining 5% of the water. Remember, gluten develops better in a lower hydration environment. So this is our last 5%. Gonna add our salt. It's gone in. And we're gonna add our levain. So I put the salt on one side. It could just be my brain that makes me do this, but I'm gonna put the levain. This is about 200 grams. I'm gonna put it on the other side. I'm just gonna sort of smear it on top. It's gonna get mixed. It's gonna have a little bit of time in the bowl, so it's all gonna get mixed in together. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Now, holding back some of the water and adding it after we've done a little bit of gluten development is a technique called bassinage. It was explained to me when I was in training as like double hydration, and we used to use it for ciabatta and like Turkish and stuff that was over 70% hydration. Like I said, when we're using a home mixer like this, we kind of need to employ every dirty trick that we can to get as much gluten in there as possible. Now that those things have added, we're just gonna bring this down. We've got our dough hook attached. We're gonna mix it on slow for probably about 3 or 4 minutes just to get everything that's in there incorporated. And then we're gonna bring that speed up to about a medium, probably for about 6 or so minutes. We're gonna check it at 6 minutes and see how we go. Okay, so that's been about 6 minutes, and I'm really happy with how that gluten's looking. See how that's nice and stretchy? Checking it for temperature is important too. So we used fridge cold water. It should be around room temp. Now, if you have a thermometer, if you have like an instant read thermometer, this is a good time to break that out. We want our dough to probably be around 26 or so degrees. Mine's coming in at 25.7. So I'm happy with that. I'm gonna call that. When handling this sort of thing, I've just ran my hand under a cold tap. Just sort of makes the dough seem like a lot easier to sort of deal with. Get that out of the way. For some reason, if you have some of these big containers, if you're a weirdo like me and you keep these in your house, these are great containers because we're now gonna start our bulk ferment phase. These containers are great to have around. The measurements on the side can make it easier to tell how your bulk ferment's going. Either way, I've just got lightly wet hands. I'm just gonna scoop my dough up here. Sort of go around the sides, sort of break it, kind of release it a little bit. Makes it easier to handle. I'm just gonna lift that up. I'm just gonna plop it in there. So there is our fully mixed dough for our sourdough country loaf. Get that little bit in there. Get in there. Now, this is the bulk ferment phase. I, through my own experience and making this loaf a bunch of times, have found that this is probably going to take about 2 hours to fully bulk ferment. So that is how long it takes me with my dough in my kitchen, made my way. Your mileage will vary, probably. There are a few things that we're gonna do to this while it's bulk fermenting. We're gonna do 2 stretch and folds. So we're gonna wait 40 minutes. We're gonna let this hang out and rise and do all of its good stuff for about 40 minutes. We're gonna give it a stretch and fold. We're gonna close it. We're gonna give it another 40 minutes. We're gonna give it another stretch and fold. And then we're gonna leave it for the remainder of its bulk ferment. 2 hours. Generally speaking, with this recipe, with my culture, how long is a piece of string is basically this thing. You just kind of got to practice. You've got to practice. The unfortunate thing is that you just need to do this a bunch and then you get better at being able to tell when it's done. So that being said, I'll see you in 40 minutes when we're going to give this a stretch and fold. Okay, so it's been about 40 minutes on our sourdough bulk ferment. So now we need to do what's called a stretch and fold. This is gonna do a few things. One, it's gonna help develop our gluten matrix. It's gonna throw strands of gluten over top of each other and create kind of like a net sort of thing. It's all very technical, you don't need to worry about that. You just need to know that it's gonna help create our gluten matrix, and it's also gonna redisperse some of the wild yeast, that lovely levain that we have spent so long making and caring for. It's gonna introduce that to new food sources and keep the fermentation train going. So a stretch and fold, it's a very simple little act. It doesn't seem like it's doing much, but it actually is. I've just lightly wet my hands. I've just run them under the cold tap. So I'm just gonna take one edge of this. It's gonna release from the container pretty like smoothly. Pull it up, stretch it out as long as I can, and then fold it over itself by about a third. I'm gonna turn it. I'm gonna do the exact same thing. And I'm gonna go all the way around. There we go. Then, right when I've gotten back to the end, I'm gonna wet my hands again, right? And then I'm gonna get underneath it. And then I'm sort of just really lightly just handle it. Baby fingers, delicate fingers, delicate fingers, delicate fingers. And then I'm just gonna sort of boule it up, but not really. I'm kind of just tucking things underneath it. That's gonna get closed, and we'll be back to do that exact same thing again in 40 minutes. Okay, so all up, this has been bulk fermenting for about 2 hours, a little bit over. Giving it 2 sets of stretch and folds. As you can see by like the nice dome sort of shape of it, gluten's nice and strong. It hasn't slacked off and turned into a puddle, so we're good to go. We're gonna do now what's called pre-shaping, which is really important. And please don't skip it like I used to try and do. We're gonna hit this with a little bit of flour, just a little bit, and we're gonna hit our work surface with just a little bit of flour. Just a tiny bit, not much. All right, this is gonna release. We're gonna catch her, and we're gonna lay it out. There we go. There's our lovely dough. This is gonna be hella sticky. It's gonna be really, really sticky. So we wanna work on the underside, the bit that's just touched the flour. See, I can touch this, I can touch that, no problem. I can touch under here, no problem. I touch up here, we got a problem. So what we're gonna try and do now is organize this into a shape that's, in short, we wanna boule this up. So dough is gonna stick to dough. Dough wants to stick to dough, especially if it's wet dough. We're gonna take it out, and a bit like our stretch and fold, we're gonna pull that up, and we're just gonna set it over the top. See how that's sticking? We're gonna go all the way around, out and in. And we're gonna be gentle, but you don't need to be like too precious with it. Then we're gonna roll her over. This is a bench scraper. I recommend that you get one if you wanna do this sort of thing. What we wanna do now is tension the top of this and round it up. Not too much, but enough that it's gonna sit and it's gonna be able to ferment for another 20 minutes, and that gluten is gonna be able to relax. We've got all that gluten there now. We've just pissed it off by like fucking with it and by making it go into a shape that it didn't want to be in. So we're gonna hit that with a tiny bit more flour, and we're just very gently we're gonna sort of like scrape underneath it to sort of just tension that top and get it rounded. See, just like that, just around. Don't need to do much. I would probably say that is pre-shaped there. So what was that? That was probably like 7 or 8 strokes of like the bench scraper. It's nice and round now. It's nice and smooth. It's not sticky at all, but it's still like buoyant and jiggly. See? This is just a bowl, and we're just gonna cover this for like 15 minutes. I really don't like using single-use plastic for this. Like a lot of people would like Glad wrap this or like use cling film or something like that. I just look for shit that's gonna fit over the top of it because I just don't really like single-use plastic anymore. Single-use plastic rant aside, we're gonna give this about 15 minutes, and then we're gonna come back and we're gonna shape it properly. Okay, so it's been about 15 minutes of our lovely sourdough here bench resting. It's spread out a little bit. It hasn't really grown much or anything like that. We are ready to shape this, get it into its banneton for its proofing, and then get it in the fridge overnight for its cold ferment. This is just a little bowl of, this is equal parts plain flour and semolina. I use this at this stage for like, if I need to put some flour on the dough to like move it around or whatever, and shaping and stuff like that. I also use this to line my banneton, because if you don't line your banneton, you'll get all the way to the end, and then as you're trying to dump your sourdough out to bake it, it'll rip, and you will not be particularly happy, as I have not been when that has happened to me. Just gonna sprinkle the top, just a little bit of that there, right? And then in one quick motion, just flipping that upside down. Cool. So this is, like I said before, this is 70% hydration. So it's not the most unworkable dough in the world. In fact, it's gonna be pretty reasonable. Now, the 2 things that I want you to keep in mind with shaping are the seam and surface tension. So 1, we wanna keep the seam on the bottom, And 2, we want to establish a good amount of surface tension. I want to preface all of this by saying there are dozens of ways to shape a sourdough. This is how I do it. It might not work for you. You might have been shown something different. This is what works for me. This is what I do. So, just like when we're pre-shaping, our top sides here are a little bit sticky. So, we're going to bring these 2 sides in, left and then right. Again, just how I do it. You don't have to do it this way. Get them nice and pushed down. Then that top, that's going to come stretch up and then down. We're going to use our fingertips to push that in nice and same again. Pull forward, push down. Pull forward, push down. Right? As we get towards the end, see this line here? Just going to bring that one towards us. There we go. Just work that with our thumbs. Tuck those ends in. Tuck those ends in nicely tight there. Right? Now this time I like to get a little bit of flour on my hands. We're just going to tuck that and just tighten that top a wee bit. Right? Just like that. Flip around. Same deal. Just tighten it from the other side. One more quick motion. We're going to flop this into a banneton. For some reason, I'm only really good at doing this when it's like vertical, but we'll try horizontal. Ba-doom, ba-doom. There we go. That's in there now. I'll show you one. This is like one additional step. If you're not particularly happy with your shaping, if you didn't think that you got enough surface tension, this is a step called stitching. So we're going to just sort of pinch little bits like that. We're just going to pull them over and just set them down. And we're just going to sort of stitch the dough shut. Cool. There we are. Sprinkle that with a little bit of flour. There we go. There we have it. That is a shaped sourdough in its banneton. Now, up to and including about 70% hydration, I wouldn't say that you need a banneton. I have certainly baked freestanding 70% sourdough loaves before. When I was competing in the Baking Association of Australia's Excellence in Baking competition, we had to do 6, at least 30% rye sourdough Viennas. I didn't use bannetons for mine. I just proofed them up on baking trays and then just put the whole trays directly into a deck oven. I was fortunate enough to win that year, so nonetheless, this is going to take probably, based on the temperature today, probably about an hour and a half to proof at like room temperature before we put it in the fridge overnight. The one very fortunate thing about bannetons is you can kind of use the lines as like a guide. So you can sort of keep track of how much it's puffed up and how much it's grown. Because proofing is definitely not like an exact science, particularly when it comes to this sort of thing. I think it's best to think of proofing as like a window. There's like underproofed and then there's overproofed and then there's like a bit of a space where it's like some people like them a little bit closer to overproofed, some people like them a little bit closer to underproofed. There's no like one size fits all. You just kind of make half a dozen loaves and then you know what you like, and that's great because then you've got half a dozen loaves of bread and your personal preference is established. But nonetheless, I'm gonna go set this in a like warm but dark spot for about an hour and we'll check back in and we'll see if she needs some more. Okay, so our sourdough has been proofing for about an hour and 40 minutes at room temperature and it's currently passing the poke test. So the poke test, for those of you who don't know, is a method of testing when bread is finished proving where you give it like a little poke and it will spring back, but it will spring back linearly and it will leave like a little indent. If it's very underproofed, it's just gonna pop back out straight away. And if it's super overproofed, you'll leave a hole and it'll collapse. But either way, I wanna stress that a lot of knowing when bread is proved is just experience. It's just doing it a bunch and baking a bunch of loaves that are kind of nearly there until you eventually get the one that is there, and then you sort of remember the characteristics that it had when it was, ready to go. And I can't express how important it is to not shortcut that step. Just practice. If you practice, you will get good at this. It's not actually rocket science, it just takes a little bit of time management and practice. So, now that this guy's fully proofed, we're gonna let this one cold ferment overnight in the fridge. This is just a freezer bag. It's just going in the fridge and it's gonna sit there overnight until I get a chance to preheat my oven and bake it tomorrow. Beauty, see you tomorrow. Okay, so it's the next day. Our country loaf has been in the fridge overnight doing its cold ferment. We're now gonna get our oven ready to steam bake. So we're gonna take this is my rock baking steel. Any baking steel or baking stone will work for this. I just like this one. We're gonna take our baking steel, we're gonna put it on like the middle rack of the oven, and we're gonna take a cast iron skillet and we're gonna put that on a lower rack and we're gonna preheat the oven to 250 degrees. Okay, so overnight, our sourdough has done a lovely bit of cold fermenting. It is nice and bulbous and puffy and ready to go. I use the word bulbous. It's ready to go in. It's ready to get baked now. Our oven is super hot, our baking steel is super hot, and our cast iron skillet that we're gonna use to make steam is super hot. So we are all ready to half bake this loaf. There's a couple things that we need to do beforehand. So the first thing is getting it out of the banneton. Now this is just a pizza peel that I've just put a piece of baking paper on. Nothing fancy, nothing special. So I'm gonna turn this loaf out. This is like kind of a consent sphere sort of thing. So you gotta be like a little bit decisive. You gotta try and get it right on the center of the paper. And you gotta sort of support it until the basket pulls away and it's all fine. So just turn it, support it, support it, support it. Gently tilt it out of the basket. That's it. If your banneton's well floured and your gluten structure is like well shaped, that should just slide out. That shouldn't be difficult. Definitely shouldn't tear. If it tears, you've got a problem. This is that same flour and semolina mix that I used to coat the banneton with. Just gonna sprinkle some of this over the top. This is gonna do a couple things. One, it's gonna stop our blade from dragging when we score it, and it's also gonna look cool. Now, the second thing that we need to do is score it, because like if we were to just put this in and bake this as it was, this would rip. It would rip open and it would ruin our lovely finish. We need to score it to provide weak points in the dough so it can safely expand in the direction that we want to. This is called a bread lame, or lame, however you want to pronounce it. It's basically a razor blade on a stick with a slight curve that you use to score bread. There are hundreds of different ways to score bread. This is what I'm going to do for this loaf because I saw a photo of it and I thought it looked cool and I want to try. So I'm going to do 2 long scores and then 1 shorter score in the middle, right? So when you're doing these cuts, it's best to be decisive. Don't sort of like middle your way through it and like saw it. Just nice, quick, clean. Let the razor blade do the work. You'll be fine. So 1. Let's go 2, shorter one there, flip the lime around, 3. So that's how I'm gonna score this loaf. Now our loaf is all scored, it's ready to go in. The last thing that we're gonna do is inject our oven with steam. So this is where that cast iron skillet that we put in is gonna come in handy. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna load the dough directly onto the baking steel, baking paper and all. Then I'm gonna cover the door of my oven with a tea towel and I'm gonna pour about a cup's worth of boiling water into that cast iron skillet. From there, at 30-second intervals, I'm gonna open the oven door and I'm gonna spray water on the back and the sides of the oven. I'm gonna do that 3 times and that's gonna provide the steam for our bake. When that's done, I'm gonna turn the temperature on the oven down from 250 to about 230 and let it go for 12 minutes completely undisturbed. The reason that we inject steam into the oven is because we want to delay the setting of that crust until the yeast has fully sprung, until the yeast goes on its little feeding frenzy because it knows it's about to die, it consumes as much food as it can, and it produces a ton of gas, which gives us that oven spring. If the crust were to set hard, it would limit the amount that the yeast could push that dough up in size, and you'd find you'd get a nasty rip or a nasty crack on the side. It would still taste really good, but you would ruin the aesthetic of your, or you at least, maybe not ruin, but you would get an aesthetic on your loaf that we're not really trying for right now. Right now, we want something clean that's gonna rise linearly and consistently. All right, so it's been about 12 minutes. Our loaf has sprung as much as it's going to spring and the crust has started setting. At this stage, we're gonna turn the temperature down from 230 to probably about 200 and leave it in there until we're satisfied with how like dark the crust is. In my mind, a pain de campagne, a country loaf, it's a dark loaf. Like it's not a pale blonde. It's like it's got quite a dark sort of like rustic-y characteristic to it. So I'm gonna start checking it probably about every 10 minutes. I'm gonna suggest that it's probably gonna take about 20 minutes to half an hour to get like the depth of color and like the maillard that I want from it. I want this to be like a crusty, crunchy, crackly loaf. I don't want this to be like a pale sort of like soft thing. I want it to be quite like toothsome, you know? Also another thing, if you're using this method, if you're using like an open bake method, this is like a good time to maybe like just give it like a little 180 degree rotate. Some ovens have warm spots. I know mine definitely is a lot warmer towards the back. I think most ovens are, but yeah. This is like a good time. It's still on baking paper, so you can just sort of pinch the corner of the paper and just give it like a little rotate. It'll really help with the like consistent browning. So we actually ended up leaving this one in for closer to 40 minutes because we just really wanted to like develop the crust. We really wanted that nice, dark, caramelized exterior. Have a look at that. Hey, doesn't that look beautiful? Look at that. Oh, she's very hot. If you've put in the time to make this, don't let it fully cool before you cut it open. And that means like fully cool. It's probably gonna take about 2 hours. I know it sucks, but just be patient. I promise you it's gonna be worth it. If you do it before then, you're absolutely going to ruin your bread's texture and its shelf life. And for something that we've just put all of this work into, for something that we've just put all of this care and all of this attention and all of this love into, that would be such a tragedy. So please let it sit at room temperature for about 2 hours on a cooling rack so it doesn't sweat, and let it come fully down to room temperature before you cut it open. And I promise you, you'll be rewarded with delicious, crusty exterior and lovely, soft, open, gorgeous interior. Oh. Name a better sound than that. I dare you. Beautiful. Let's just cut a few really nice slices here. I will always have a soft spot for the 30% wholemeal. When I was doing the odd little like catering gig, I used to call this loaf the John Denver, because thank God it's a country loaf. The 30% wholemeal, I think 100% white sourdough is delicious and lovely and great, but I want a little bit of wholemeal in there. I like the texture. I think the nuttiness is delicious. That is our country loaf. Oh my God. I'm so floored with that. Beautiful, beautiful loaf. Okay, so for our non-sourdough, so our commercial yeast country loaf, we're gonna use the exact same ratio of flours, exact same flours again, salt, water, again, exact same hydration, but we're also gonna use yeast. This is Lowen's instant dried yeast. This is available in supermarkets. Very cheap, very easy to get your hands on. So for this dough, we're using a pre-ferment technique called pate fermente, or old dough. We're gonna be using 50% old dough and 50% new dough, I guess you'd call it. So the way to think about this is that we're actually gonna make 2 batches of the same dough and then combine them. We're gonna make this is the old dough, the pre-ferment, the pate fermente. We're gonna make this today. We're gonna let it bulk ferment at room temperature for about an hour, and then we're gonna throw it in the fridge overnight. And then we're gonna make another batch of this dough tomorrow. We're gonna mix that pre-ferment in, and then that's gonna be our dough that we're gonna let bulk ferment, shape, proof, and bake. The exact measurements for everything are down in the description below. And it's also worth noting, I'm making this second loaf a little bit smaller because instead of open baking it like we did with the sourdough, we're gonna bake this one in a cast iron Dutch oven. This is like a sidebar. Please get a scale. Please get a scale and start using things in grams. If you use grams for like one day, you'll realize how silly ounces are. This is a pretty fancy like coffee scale. It's accurate to 0.1 of a gram. You don't need anything this accurate. You can kind of get away with just rounding up and down a lot of the time. But please, you'll make your life and you'll make your baking and you'll make even your cooking so much easier if you just get a nice digital scale. Not even a nice one, doesn't need to be expensive, but please get a scale. Okay, so the mixing of this dough is gonna be a little bit different to how we mix the sourdough. Our flours are still both gonna go in at the same time. So there's the white, there's the wholemeal, and 65% of our water. Again, I'm using fridge cold water because this is gonna get left to stand. They're gonna go in, but so is our yeast. Our yeast is going in as well. And we're gonna mix this a similar way, but instead of doing an autolyse, we're gonna do a fermentolyse. The end goal of this is very similar to an autolyse, but we've already added the yeast, right? So the ferment in fermentolyse is gonna come from the fact that this is going to begin fermentation. We're still holding back our salt and we're still holding back our last 5% of the water, but what we're trying to do is it's the same as the autolyse. We're trying to establish a little bit of gluten through time and science rather than just having to beat the shit out of it. I'm using the paddle again, just to get this one started. And just like the sourdough, we're just gonna mix this on the slowest speed for probably about 3 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 3 minutes again. Very similar looking to how our sourdough boy was. She just rips. She's got no resistance at all. It just rips. So we're done with the paddle, and we're gonna take a plate and we're gonna cover this for about, instead of an hour, probably about 15 minutes, maybe 20, right? So when you're doing a fermentolyse instead of an autolyse, you have a little bit of a time limit. I've heard of people autolysing stuff for like up to 24 hours, overnight in the fridge. People autolyse all sorts of stuff. With a fermentolyse, when you have the yeast in there and fermentation starts, If you wait much longer than about 20 minutes, instead of strengthening the gluten matrix and, you know, chemically providing that matrix, the opposite can happen, and the yeast, it creates a special chemical that will actually start to break down that gluten matrix. So we're gonna give it about 20 minutes, and then we're gonna come back and we're gonna attach our dough hook. We're going to add the salt and the water that we held back, and then we're gonna finish kneading this dough. Okay, so it's been about 20 minutes. As we can see, same things happened. Dough is nice and stretchy. Ooh, how about that, hey? Nice and stretchy little ball of dough. So we're gonna attach our dough hook. Duck, if you would. What's that? What's that Star Wars character? Dooku. No, okay, ignore it. And we're gonna add fuck. And we're gonna add in the salt and the water that we held back. So salt in, water in. Mix it slowly for about 2 or 3 minutes just to get the salt and the water in there, and then we're gonna knead it probably for about 6 minutes again. Okay, so this dough has been getting whipped for about 7 or 8 minutes. Come together nicely. You know, she's, you know, for a 70%, she's a little bit on the sticky side, but like not too much to be like a pain in the ass to handle. This pre-ferment here, this is the old dough. So this is the first half of our dough recipe for our country loaf. So this is gonna get bouled up, just turn into a nice little boule, put in this container that's way too big for it. I do know how stupid this looks. And then this is gonna get covered. This is gonna get left to rise at room temperature for about an hour. Then I'm gonna punch it down, degas it, boule it up again, and then it's gonna go in the fridge overnight. It's gonna develop, it's gonna ferment, it's gonna create a lot of flavor. It's gonna be like a really big shot of flavor for our loaf. Using a pre-ferment like this, when it's like the same recipe as the dough, but we're gonna use it the next day, it makes bread taste more like bread. That's literally the only way that I can describe it. Give it a try, you'll know exactly what I mean. Okay, so it's been about an hour, and our pre-ferment, our pâté fermenté for our non-sourdough country loaf has just about doubled in size. It's nice and poofy, it's nice and full of air. You can see there's bubbles there. So what we're gonna do with this, just lightly wet my hands again. We're gonna punch this down, make sure we scoop it all up. Get that all out of there. We're just gonna boule this up, and then very simply, this is gonna go back into its container. That is just gonna go in the fridge overnight. Much like with how we put the sourdough in the fridge overnight, that's gonna continue to develop flavor like really slowly. So that fermentation is gonna continue happening because commercial yeast will do the same thing. It going in the fridge, it's just gonna slow everything down, and it's gonna ferment really slowly and really just develop some really nice flavor. Okay, so it's the next day. Before we start mixing the other half of our non-sourdough country loaf, we're gonna take our lovely pâté fermenté from the fridge, and we're just gonna leave it out at like room temperature for an hour, just to take the chill off, just to get it a little bit closer to room temperature so we're not throwing a huge cold mass of dough in with our fresh dough. Okay, so now we're gonna make the new dough portion of our non-sourdough country loaf. This is the exact same recipe as yesterday's, so we're gonna mix it, we're gonna do our 20-minute ferment release, and then we're gonna incorporate our old dough that we made yesterday into it. Cool. Oh, there's the postman. Oh, very good. Oh, he caught me looking at him. Okay, so our ferment release is done. Our dough's taken on a nice stretchy quality. I've got my old dough just here. Before I throw this in here, I'm just gonna cut this up into like little bits, just so it incorporates a little bit easier, and it's not just like one big chunk going in. Get that in there, and of course, in is also gonna go my salt and that little bit of water that I held back before. Gonna mix this slow for about a minute just to mix everything together, and then I'm gonna knead it on like a medium speed for probably about 8 minutes. You may notice that it kind of like slips around the bowl a little bit when you add in that extra water, when you add in the bassinnage. It will take it on, just kind of trust the process and let it run. It will take the water on and it will become part of the dough. Okay, so that's been about 8 minutes. Gluten is nice and developed, she's nice and stretchy and lively. Now this is going to go through the exact same bulk fermenting procedure. So that's just going in a container that I can put a lid on. It's gonna sit and hang out for about 40 minutes. Exact same procedure, slightly wet hands, just gonna up round, just dragging all 4 corners in. Just sort of resetting them back on the top. This will probably be a little bit gassier than the sourdough one. That's okay. Don't worry too much about that. You're redispersing and you're redistributing the air bubbles in there. as you do this. And if you pop some of the bigger ones, don't worry about it, it's fine. So that's the first set of stretchy folds. We're gonna do another set in 40 minutes. Another 40 minutes have passed, so we're just gonna give our second set of stretch and folds to our lovely non-sourdough yeasted country loaf. After this, we're gonna give it another 40 minutes, and then we're gonna turn it out onto a bench, pre-shape it, and then shape it for proofing. Okay, so it's been about 2 hours, and I'm happy to call it on the bulk ferment of our non-sourdough country loaf. It's nice and puffy, and it's got a bit of that like beery sort of smell that you get from like bulk fermenting something with commercial yeast. Same kind of smell that I found that like baguettes and stuff like that has at this stage. So I'm just gonna put a tiny bit of flour on my work surface here, tiny bit of flour on the dough. We're just gonna gently get that to release. Come on you. And from here on out, it's basically the exact same as making our sourdough country loaf. We're gonna pre-shape this, we're gonna let it bench rest, and then we're gonna shape it, proof it, bake it. Okay, so about 20 minutes later, our dough is rested, the gluten's nice and relaxed, it's ready for shaping. So I'm gonna get the top with just a little bit of flour, just a little bit, not much. Flip her over. Exact same way that we shaped our sourdough. So we're gonna get this down to here. Oh, actually no, I'm gonna show a different method. So, instead of tucking the sides in, we're actually just gonna go from the top, and we're gonna go all the way down, right? Just gonna pop those couple of really big air bubbles there. So, take this, and we're gonna push it in, right? And then we're sort of gonna I like to lightly flour my fingertips first, just to really, one of my first mentors called this breaking its back. Really get that seam tucked in there, and then you're gonna pinch, you're gonna roll again. You see where I'm going with this? Get those ends tucked and then pinch again, and just remember, we wanna keep those two things in mind. We wanna keep the seam, and we wanna keep surface tension. So that's getting nice and tight. A little bit more like sausagey sort of shaped than our sourdough one. Our sourdough one's sort of like a bit more fat, where this one's a bit longer. So means to an end. Anyway, we're gonna roll that one over, tuck the inside of that with our thumbs, flip around, same again on the other side. This one's gonna be a wee bit easier to handle than the sourdough one, but if you wanna make sourdough and you want some extra practice in shaping, I would recommend doing a ton of these. Because of that very light, I'm just gonna dust this with a tiny bit of flour, just give that a little bit of a rub down. If you want practice doing it, well, you don't have to commit to getting your starter mature and fed and timing and all that. It's just kind of like an easier way to practice shaping higher hydration loaf, because this is still 70% hydration. This is just on some paper on a sheet pan, just so I can move it around. This is probably gonna prove up for about an hour, and in the meantime, we're gonna get our oven on to about 250 degrees, and we're gonna preheat our Dutch oven. It's not gonna double in size. We're probably gonna get it to like 1.5 times size, 150% the size that it is now. And that's generally about when we're gonna give it the poke test, score it, bake it, have a good time. This Dutch oven is like a fairly cheap Baccarat that I bought at one of those like kitchen store closing down sales that never end. It is fine. It gets the job done. It's like an oval shape, which I wanted because I wanted this specifically for making bread. As you can see, if you bake a ton of bread in them, they do get fairly marked up over the years. So I don't really see the point in spending $400 or $500 on like a Le Creuset or like a Stab or something like that if it's gonna get marked up like this. I have never wanted more performance than this thing is willing to give me. It's just a little bit smaller, which is why the recipe for this loaf is a little bit smaller. I imagine that a lot of people wouldn't have a Dutch oven big enough to accommodate a kilo artisanal loaf in it. Can't believe I described it as sausage shaped. Alrighty, so it's been an hour on the nose, and I'm really happy with how this has proved up. We're gonna score it. We're gonna get our Dutch oven out of the oven. We're gonna score it, and we're going to bake it. In the interest of showing some contrast, instead of using a lame this time, I'm just gonna use, this is just a regular steak knife. I'm gonna score this one in a little bit more of a basic, I would say, fashion. Not that it's bad. Not this bad. It's gonna still turn out a beautiful loaf. First thing we're gonna do is make a single score directly down the middle. With a little bit of flour first, make sure the knife doesn't drag. And then we're gonna do a tiny shallow cut on the inside of both of those seams that we've created, right? So it's gonna make like a channel down the middle. Now this boy, we're gonna pick it up by the paper. We're gonna plop him into our Dutch oven. We're gonna throw The lid on there. We're gonna bake this guy. So, the Dutch oven is a different method of applying steam to the bake. So we've just put that loaf, keep in mind, is about 70% water, into an incredibly hot environment. That water is going to evaporate, but that lid is going to keep that steam in there, and that's going to keep that crust, it's going to keep the outside gelatinous. It's going to stop it from forming a hard crust that's going to stop the yeast from expanding. It's just a different method of steaming. The open baking method, I use Peter Reinhardt's method, the method that he details in The Bread Baker's Apprentice, but I fully understand that it's like a lot. I personally really like the results, and I like not being inhibited by the size of my Dutch oven, but it's a lot of shit to do. It's a lot of water near very hot surfaces. So we're gonna bake that sealed for probably about 15 minutes, and then we're gonna pull the lid off, finish baking it open so it can crust up properly. Okay, so we've just pulled our Dutch oven out of the oven, we've pulled the lid off, and we're gonna finish baking it now. We're gonna turn the temperature on the oven down to about 200 degrees, and we're gonna let it go until it's brown to the point that we want it. You know, like the sourdough, in my mind, a country loaf, it really does bring to mind like the darker, more rustic, crustier sort of side of things rather than like the paler side. So we're probably gonna push it. It's probably gonna take about half an hour again. The sourdough is closer to 40 minutes, but the sourdough is also a lot bigger. Okay, so it's been about half an hour, and I'm really happy with how our loaf is looking, really happy with the color of it. I've left it a little bit paler intentionally on this one. This kind of pâte fermentée non-sourdough sort of thing is never quite gonna get the same blisters that like a sourdough that sat in the fridge overnight is gonna get. So that is a non-sourdough pâte fermentée old dough country loaf, pain de Campagne. This is gonna be quite like it's gonna be a little bit like a wholemeal baguette sort of thing. Ooh, it's starting to crackle, listen. Hear that? Hear those crackles? Yeah, that's the crust contracting as the steam leaves it. Here's some bread ASMR. Now, just like our lovely sourdough, this does need to be fully cool before we slice into it, so see you in a couple of hours. I'm sorry, it's just the way that it is. A good amount of time later, we're ready to cut into our non-sourdough country loaf. Ooh. Ooh, very impressive. Very happy with that crumb. The kind of rustic charm and like the accessibility of it in particular makes me think of commercial yeast rather than sourdough. Just the fact that like anyone could make this with like a day's preparation makes me think of like that kind of rustic homemade sort of affair. Whereas the sourdough is something that you have to put a lot of time and a lot of love and a lot of effort and a lot of practice into. This is the sort of thing that you could make just off the cuff. You know, if you had a function to go to on a weekend and you get told about it on a Wednesday, you know, you've got plenty of time to make the pre-ferment, let it age. You know, you've got plenty of time to do those sort of things. I think the accessibility of something like country loaf, pain de Campagne, however you want to pronounce it, I think the accessibility of it is something that's really important. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you got something from this. The country loaf, the pain de Campagne, this loaf has always been really important to me. This was one of the first sourdoughs that I ever learned how to make. I think having the delicate, you know, time-consuming, lovely, beautiful sourdough is amazing, but I also don't think that you should discount how accessible the non-sourdough version can be. You know, I still make these all the time. I have a tin loaf recipe that I swear by, which is the same percentages but like a little bit bigger but chucked into a tin. I might make a video on that one day, I might not. But either way, don't discount this because this is a gorgeous loaf and anybody would be happy to receive this or have it sliced up on their table, perhaps with some hot crab dip. Subscribe if that's a thing that you feel like doing. Thank you so much for watching Bradley's Bakehouse. Have a good day.